Hello everybody and welcome to our second video in our series of videos on the Great Famine from 1845 to 1851. Today what we're going to be looking at is the course of the famine and some of the government's responses to this massive crisis that was happening in Ireland. As always, we start with our learning outcomes, so by the end of the video you should know two government responses to the failure of the potato crop in Ireland in 1845. We'll come across a term called Laissez Faire. You should know what Laissez Faire means. And third, you should know two government responses to the crisis in 1847. So we're going to be looking at how they responded between 1845 and 1847 to this humanitarian crisis. Last time we looked at the causes of the famine. So we saw there was a rise in population. We saw the subdivision of the land was becoming an issue. We saw that there was this over-dependence on the potato. And we talked about the potato blight. To remind you, this potato blight is a disease that attacks and rots potatoes. The inside becomes black and it is completely inedible. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at how the potato blight progressed throughout the country. So the first signs of the potato blight happened in 1845. All the potatoes that had been planted early were okay, but any potatoes that had been planted later, there was a huge amount of them were destroyed. A third of the entire crop was destroyed. This was a massive problem, as potatoes were the main food source for everybody, and in some cases the only food source for people. A third of the crop being destroyed is quite devastating. In 1846 it got worse. The entire crop was destroyed. It was inedible. So now all these people who had been eating 5-6 kilos of potatoes a day, they had nothing to sustain themselves. In 1847, less potatoes were destroyed, but less had been planted because people had been so desperately hungry in 1846. They had eaten a lot of the seeds. They had also less people to work and to plant the potatoes. So while the blight wasn't as bad, the harvest was bad because there wasn't as much planted. In 1848, again, 3/4 of the crop destroyed. Not quite as much as the entire crop, but still a large amount. In 1849, the blight was less severe, but still did huge damage. And the same again in 1850. It's quite similar to 1845. So as you can see, over those 6 years, the potato was not growing in this country. So how did the government respond? In 1845, the Prime Minister of England was known as Sir Robert Peel. He decided to import about €127,000 worth of maize, about £100,000, probably an easier number to remember. So maize is corn, but the Irish couldn't cook it, and there were only 2 mills in the whole country capable of grinding the corn. So it became known as Peel's brimstone because people couldn't eat this food that was supposed to help them. Now, without getting into too many of the details, Peel did realise that this had the potential to be a terrible catastrophe to Ireland. However, when massive deaths weren't reported back in England in this first potato crop failure, people thought he had been too fast to act and he was handing out charity which he shouldn't have handed out. And despite people not being able to really cook this stuff, this idea did ensure that conditions didn't get too bad in 1845. Another thing that he did was he set up public work schemes. So this was where men would go and they would build roads and work on piers to earn money because the government wouldn't give out charity. The Victorians were quite funny in their views on and we will talk about that in a second, on what charity was and how receiving charity was a bad thing. But they saw this as an opportunity. You will work and you will earn your money. So this was their way of giving out charity. People had to work, and many of them ended up building these famine roads that went from nowhere to nowhere. You would think that people would kind of respond in a better way. But in 1846, Robert Peel was replaced as Prime Minister by this man here, Lord John Russell. And Lord John Russell believed that Ireland should not get any charity. So he stopped importing maize. The food sources that came in were now not coming in. He believed in this thing called Laissez Faire policy, and he expanded the public works schemes. So what is Laissez Faire? This is one of our learning outcomes. The government of Britain didn't believe that they should be getting involved in people's day-to-day lives and that things naturally work themselves out. They believed that it would be unethical for the government to intervene and that helping the poor would only make them lazy and dependent. This is a shocking attitude by today's standards, what we might call blaming the victim. But it is really indicative of the thought process that was going on in Britain, despite the reports coming back about the deadly diseases, the deadly conditions that people were living in. Now, the man in charge of handing out relief for the Irish was a civil servant known as Sir Charles Trevelyan. And he believed that what was happening was divine intervention, that this was God weeding out the bad. We talked about the plantations and the desire to spread British culture, kill off the Irish language, and make the people of Ireland good British subjects. Well, here was an opportunity for these people. They could see all these disloyal, backward Irish being killed, and this was God's sign that they should die and that the people who survived would become good British citizens and we could educate them in the British way. Because things were so bad, they did have to act. It was such a huge crisis after the entire crop failed in 1846 that they expanded the public works scheme. So these were enlarged, and 750,000 people were employed in these schemes. The problem with this is that they had to work, and it was based on performance. So it wasn't just you showed up to work and you got money. You had to have hit a certain amount of targets to get your money. But if you have not eaten and you had to walk 10 miles to where the Famine Road is being constructed, or 20 miles, by the time you get there, you are not going to be a very productive person. So many people were just died on the side of these roads that they were constructing, trying in some way to get some food. Now, there were not all bad people here. The Quakers, or the Societies of Friends, they began to set up soup kitchens in 1846. So this was a private religion that set up soup kitchens in a few areas, one of them being actually in Escorty in Wexford. But the problem with this was that the Quakers themselves were a very small minority within the Irish population. So they could only set up in a very limited amount of areas. However, it did inspire the Soup Kitchen Act of 1847. 1847 is known as Black 47 because things got so bad. We'll talk a little bit about that in our next video, but just that the government then did bring in the Soup Kitchen Act of 1847. We talked in the last video about workhouses. So these were basically like prisons that kept people in there, and your family would be separated from you, and you would be doing meaningless work such as breaking rocks for these famine roads that are being built. So we talked about there being over 130 workhouses in the country. They were only meant to have space for the 100,000 people, but things were so bad they crammed 200,000 people into the workhouses. We're going to be looking at disease next week, which was a bigger killer than starvation. And conditions like this, where you are cramming people in, are where disease really spreads. Things were so bad in the workhouse that eventually, in 1848 it was, they eventually brought in this thing called outdoor relief. So there was an extra 1 million people looking for food. So the government set up outdoor relief, which were these outdoor soup kitchens. People didn't have a place to sleep, but there was outside there was a place where they could get food, and they reckon up to a million people would avail of this outdoor relief policy. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So you should know 2 government responses to the failure of the potato crop in Ireland in 1845. So we're looking at the Indian corn, or Peel's brimstone. We're looking at the setting up of public works. We're talking about Laissez Faire. So again, Laissez Faire believes that the government shouldn't interfere and these things will correct themselves. And finally, you should know 2 responses in 1847. So as things got worse, we saw the workhouses were really bulging with people. We saw that public works schemes were set up again, and we saw the beginning of the soup kitchens and the Soup Kitchen Act coming in. Hope you learned a bit from this presentation, and I look forward to seeing you in class.